Excellencies, distinguished participants, dear friends and colleagues, good afternoon. On behalf of the event organizers, the Alliance of Small Island States, the United Nations Office of the High Representative for the Least Developed Countries, Landlocked Developing Countries, and the Small Island Developing States, OHRLLS, Climate Analytics, and our host, United Arab Emirates, welcome to this event entitled Less Division, More Ambition, a high-level dialogue on loss and damage in small island developing states. I also wish to acknowledge the support we've received from the United Nations Resident Coordinator's Office in the United Arab Emirates. Thank you, colleagues. My name is Tishka Francis, and I head the Small Island Developing States Sub-Program with the Office of the High Representative. And I have the honor of moderating today's event. This event will be a discussion on both challenges and opportunities to continue building momentum to ensure that the international community concretely supports the needs of small island developing states on loss and damage. The program consists of 3 parts: welcome remarks, an expert presentation, and a high-level panel. So without further ado, I will now introduce our opening speakers. Firstly, we will hear opening remarks from His Excellency Gaston Browne, Prime Minister of Antigua and Barbuda, and the Chair of the Alliance of Small Island States. And thank you, Prime Minister, for joining us. This will be followed by remarks from Ms. Rabab Fatima, Undersecretary General and High Representative for the Least Developed Countries, Landlocked Developing Countries, and Small Island Developing States. So without further ado, I would like to invite Prime Minister Gaston Browne to the podium to deliver his opening remarks.
Thank you, Madam Chairlady. Special good afternoon to the distinguished ladies and gentlemen present here at this forum. And I certainly want to thank the Undersecretary for taking the initiative to continue to ensure that the SIDS office champions this issue that is so important to the members of the Alliance of Small Island States. 30 years ago, ahead of the Rio Earth Summit in 1991, Vanuatu, on behalf of AOSIS, called for an insurance mechanism to be included in what would later become the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Even then, we as SIDS recognized that loss and damage as a result of climate change was inevitable. At that time, AOSIS rightly proposed that developed nations should pay into a pool to meet the costs that would otherwise be borne by island nations and low-lying developing states. Unfortunately, that proposal was rejected, marking the start of a campaign which continues to this day on loss and damage funding arrangements. For more than 3 decades, we have championed this issue, and for more than 30 years, it has been met with huge resistance by developed country partners. Every year, governments and corporations make grand statements at COPs on the ambition to tackle the climate crisis, but we are yet to see any accountability for these actions. While we argue over the establishment of an agenda item to discuss the possibility of funding arrangements to address loss and damage, the oil and gas industry has raked in $1 trillion per year for the last 50 years. In fact, this year, they are literally on target to make about $2 trillion. In the first half of this year, just 6 fossil fuel companies made enough to cover the cost of major climate events in developing countries, with nearly $70 billion in profits. This is the reality we're up against, and we need the UN system's coordinated response and support to ensure a comprehensive system-wide response to this issue. Loss and damage response finance is critical not only for dealing with climate impacts in developing countries, but for maintaining the trust and credibility that has been espoused in the UN climate negotiations for 30 years. AOSIS worked tirelessly to develop a concrete proposal on financing to address loss and damage, and after 30 years, it is finally on the agenda here at COP27. Colleagues, this is just the first step. AOSIS has fought hard for incremental progress, yet after decades, loss and damage is still extremely politically contentious. This issue underlines the injustice at the very heart of climate change. For many of us in small developing states, climate change has become an existential threat where our status as a group of people is at a risk of being lost. The loss of lives, livelihood, culture, tradition is threatened to the perils of no return if we do not close the emissions gap required by science. This means peaking emissions immediately, halving emissions by 2030, and net zero by 2050. We must not relent on these ambitions. Without this mitigation action, communities that are highly vulnerable to climate impacts will become exponentially more prone to experiencing loss and damage. We cannot afford to ignore the devastation in Pakistan or the devastation that Pakistan endured at our current global surface temperature, which is about 1.1 degrees Celsius. If we are on track for 2.5 or 2.7 degree of warming, can you imagine the levels of loss that we will face in the future? It is unconscionable for our world leaders to stand by and do nothing, knowing that for over 30 years, this has been a priority for small island nations. The members of AOSIS are at their limits, figuratively and literally. We are enduring worsening and ever more devastating climate change impacts beyond our adaptation efforts, while being dealt the added blow of non-concessional loans to recover. The operationalization of a new fit-for-purpose multilateral loss and damage response fund under the financial mechanism of the UNFCCC is critical, and we look forward to your support in seeing this come to fruition. Once again, I thank you very much for having me. Thank you.
Thank you, Prime Minister Browne, for your remarks and for your impassioned call to action for addressing loss and damage in small island developing states. I now will invite High Representative Rabab Fatima to make her remarks.
His Excellency, the Honorable Gaston Browne, Prime Minister of Antigua and Barbuda and Chair of the Alliance of Small Island States, distinguished panelists, Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, Assalamu alaikum and a good afternoon. I'm honored to join Prime Minister Browne in warmly welcoming you to our joint event together with the Alliance of Small States and Climate Analytics. I also thank the government of the United Arab Emirates for kindly hosting us in this beautiful pavilion. Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, the science is clear. Loss and damage due to the climate crisis is happening now. Alarmingly, it is happening in some of the world's most vulnerable nations, the small island developing states. But as the title of this event suggests, there continues to be divisions. Division on whether loss and damage should be financed and to what extent. Division on whether it should be addressed through existing mechanisms or new ones. But this is not a new issue. It is almost a decade since member states agreed to address loss and damage through the Warsaw International Mechanism. And yet, we have seen too little action to support small island developing states, let alone other highly vulnerable, climate vulnerable nations. During this time, the countries who have contributed the least to the climate crisis continue to bear the brunt and foot the bill. Indeed, over the past 50 years, small island developing states lost $153 billion to weather, climate, and water-related hazards. We can only imagine what that money could have done for these countries. Better health, better education, better infrastructure. Climate change and its impacts exacerbate debt for small island developing states and lower their credit ratings. They add an average of 24% to debt to GDP ratios. Distinguished colleagues, this means they're forced to redirect limited budgets earmarked for sustainable development, climate adaptation, and disaster risk reduction to service this rising debt. As climate-related risks rise, climate finance received by the small island developing states decline from $2.1 billion in 2018 to $1.5 billion in 2019. That funding is not proportional to their needs, as their nationally determined contributions, the NDCs, are worth around $92 billion. The needs are great, and yet the international climate finance architecture has proven too slow and inadequate to address the needs of the island nations. Excellencies, as the Secretary General reminded us yesterday, loss and damage is a moral imperative. It is a fundamental question of international solidarity and climate justice. Addressing loss and damage at COP27 is the #1 litmus test of how seriously both developed and developing governments take the growing climate toll on the most vulnerable countries. We can only hope that finally loss and damage is getting the attention it deserves. Indeed, COP26 established the Glasgow Dialogue to discuss arrangements for the funding of activities to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage. I wish to stress here that a time-bound discussion, which will lead to concrete action, including on financing to avert and address loss and damage, is utmostly of critical importance to us. In March, the UN Secretary General announced that the UN will work to ensure that within 5 years, every person on Earth is protected by early warning system. The action plan prepared by WMO, UNDRRR, and other UN entities will be launched here in COP27. Ahead of COP27, we saw the willingness on the part of the European Union to support talks on loss and damage here in Egypt. We also saw the governments of Scotland and Denmark committing some $15 million between them. And we saw finance ministers from the world's most climate vulnerable countries agree to work with Germany and other developed economies to establish a finance and insurance mechanism to address climate risk. These efforts are welcome, but we need more ambition and a more systematic approach. What small island developing states need and what they deserve is rapidly scaled up and steady financing. The proposal by the Alliance of Small Island States and other vulnerable nations for a fit-for-purpose fund to address loss and damage is timely and deserves our serious attention. Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, now more than ever, SIDS need global support for resilience building. We need to address once and for all the issue of vulnerability. This is where the Multidimensional Vulnerability Index, currently being developed by the high-level panel co-chaired by His Excellency Prime Minister Gaston Browne and former Prime Minister of Norway, Her Excellency Erna Solberg, offers one such solution as a tool to measure a country's vulnerability more comprehensively and better shape the scale of international support for the SIDS. The scale of this issue is such that we cannot take a piecemeal approach. The time has come to move from an incremental to a transformational approach built on the foundations of rigorous climate attribution of science and research. For small island developing states and other vulnerable country groups, I sincerely hope that we can make tangible progress and loss and damage here in Sharm el-Sheikh and through to COP28 in the United Arab Emirates. There's still time to approach the climate crisis with the ambition required. Let us use that time wisely. Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, my office remains fully invested in supporting small island developing states and advocating your priorities, especially as we prepare for the 4th United Nations Conference on the Small Island Developing States in 2024. I thank you.
Thank you, High Representative Rabab Fatima, for those remarks, highlighting the progress made and stretching the urgent need to ramp up ambition through a more systemic approach. I now have the honor to introduce our host, and a representative from the United Arab Emirates, Ms. Hannah Al-Hashimi, the Chief Negotiator for the UAE. Please.
Good afternoon. Your Excellency Prime Minister Gaston Browne, Your Excellency High Representative Ms. Rabab Fatima, Excellencies, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the United Arab Emirates Pavilion. And I'd like to thank the United Nations and AOSIS for convening this critical conversation today. Small island developing states have been tireless champions of the climate agenda as frontline responders, as advocates for financial system reform, and as early adopters of renewable energy and nature-based solutions. We in the United Arab Emirates have been honored to partner with 30 countries over the last 9 years in implementing first-of-a-kind energy projects, from solar battery systems for outer islands to collapsible wind turbines for disaster risk reduction and resilience. At the same time, our humanitarian work with SIDS has unfortunately caught up with our energy work. Recovery from climate-induced disasters is now part and parcel of our partnerships. And just before the United Nations General Assembly, Antigua and Barbuda and the UAE tellingly inaugurated the rebuilt power system of Barbuda. As we have seen this week, and it has been raised time and again in the Sharm el-Sheikh Implementation Summit, loss and damage is an issue that raises the collective pulse. But we will not succeed in the COP process by ignoring the reality of the world. We must meet the world where it is and then take practical steps to change it. As the incoming presidency of COP28, the United Arab Emirates is committed to identifying and rallying the process around these pragmatic solutions, both inside and outside the negotiations. There's a cry for help and for justice as climate impacts pile up, and we must develop a menu of options that can move the needle on both prevention and response. We face a similar challenge on the energy transition. Zero carbon is our future, but the world depends on fossil fuels for 80% of supply and reacts very badly to supply crises, as we have seen this year. Sidestepping the starting point is not helpful. The conversation must be about what we do between now and COP28 to maximize energy and minimize emissions in line with the Paris Agreement. I appreciate that these will be difficult conversations. In many ways, these are the taboos of the COP process. But I can assure how much the United Arab Emirates values its friendships with AOSIS members, and we are committed to fostering an honest, solutions-focused dialogue over the next year. The COP process only suffers if we pretend the climate impacts on SIDS are far off and inconsequential, and we hope to come together with our shared values and shared cultures and history in order to create a better future together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Al-Hashimi, for those remarks, showcasing the United Arab Emirates' track record on climate change and being a bridge for the global north and global south in supporting vulnerable countries like the SIDS. Now, having those remarks, we will provide We will go to the next part of our program, which is an expert presentation by Ambassador Janine Felson of Belize. So what we will do here is have a bit of a transition. We will ask our high-level representatives to take their leave, and our panelists can also join the stage. If that's
No, okay, I won't. I just want to make sure that. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, excellencies. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I want to make two disclaimers. First, I don't think I'm any more of an expert than those who are sitting on this panel, nor the Prime Minister of Antigua and Barbuda. And my second disclaimer is that I will try as best as I can to stay within the bounds of my presentation, which is to focus on the science. I'm not a scientist. Focus on where we are since Glasgow and where we need to go after COP27. So on the science, I will be brief. I think it's clear, and we've heard it already from two statements, from the Prime Minister as well as from the High Representative, that the world is heading in the wrong direction. Global warming continues unabated. There have been movements, indeed, since Paris that would have emissions reductions come down further than they were prior to Paris, but they're nowhere near where they need to be in order for us to avoid an overshoot of 1.5 degrees. This is very critical because, as we've already heard, we are living in a world that is already 1.1 degrees warmer. And this year, as last year, we have seen record-shattering climate events all across the globe, every corner of the world. And the devastation in the most vulnerable countries are unprecedented. We've heard about Pakistan. In my own country, Belize, we just suffered a hurricane, which is a category 1 on the lower scale of hurricanes. But the devastation, because of the timing of that hurricane, because of the wind, because of the sheer precipitation, has been significant. Every single country can reflect on an event that they have not seen before, and that's because we're in a warmer world. Small island developing states are considered global hotspots of vulnerability. Sea level rise will continue. We will be impacted. We are already impacted. Some islands have already seen their smaller islands or outer islands submerged. Water is becoming an issue because of sea inundation of the sea. These are essential things that matter to just the basic services that we can provide to our people. This is at the current warming. It will only get worse as global warming continues. The IPCC 6th assessment report indicated that climate resilient development cannot even be guaranteed at 1.5 degrees. That's a significant statement. It's also significant that it did confirm that there is loss and damage occurring. Losses and damages is what they've said. Nonetheless, it refers to the fact that there are irreversible losses and damages that are particularly impacting small island developing states. It also found that there is no comprehensive assessment of finance for loss and damage. And that's the issue that we're addressing here. Loss and damage finance. Yes, we know that there are buckets of finance that have been provided in the past for impacts, humanitarian, and indeed through various channels for development financing. But there is no systemic response to the types of impacts we're seeing. There's no systemic response for events that we call slow onset events, sea level rise. It's not just one thing that happens. It occurs over time. And indeed, even the IPCC says that SIDS will face these multi-hazard, cumulative climate impacts over time. And there's no response that we can turn to address it. There are two things that came out of the opening remarks that I think is clear. There is an injustice. There's a clear injustice that is occurring now. And the second thing is that there is a responsibility. And that responsibility exists within the United Nations Framework Convention climate change regime. That responsibility is to protect the most vulnerable. But we have not yet protected the most vulnerable. For 30 years, we've been talking about protecting the most vulnerable. For 30 years, we've been workshopping the protection of the most vulnerable. I don't want to give the impression that we haven't had funds that have been created under the convention, operating entities like the Green Climate Fund and, of course, the Global Environment Facility that have been channels for climate finance. But the focus has been on mitigation and adaptation, not on loss and damage. In fact, even the independent evaluation unit of the Green Climate Fund has determined that the fund is not fit for purpose to address loss and damage. So in Glasgow, we aimed to establish through the UNFCCC a loss and damage facility or fund. But of course, that effort was curtailed, and we were left with a Glasgow dialogue focusing on discussions on funding arrangement. Again, another workshop to talk about the issues that are pressing to vulnerable countries. That Glasgow dialogue would have amounted to maybe 18 hours in total. And as many of the small island developing states representatives indicated at the dialogue in June, it was a dialogue to nowhere. So the group of 77 in China decided to propose an agenda item for funding arrangements on loss and damage. And we did get pushback, but fortunately, at the opening of COP27, it was agreed that we would have that agenda item. As the AOSIS chair has said, this is just the beginning. The accomplishment is important. We have an agenda item, but what we want is a fund. We want to have that systemic response. And the UNFCCC can no longer absolve itself of its responsibility to protect the most vulnerable, and that requires support. So I will leave it there. I think there was one other issue that I was supposed to address. Well, how do we ensure that we can make progress? The title of this event is prophetic. Less division, more ambition. More ambition, yes, we still need to have more ambitious emission reduction targets because we need to maintain the global warming limit of 1.5. We also need to cooperate together to see to it that we can achieve what the small island developing states and least developed countries and other developing countries have put on the table. A request to find a fit-for-purpose fund, fit for purpose, because we do not want to repeat the missteps of the Green Climate Fund. Fit for purpose, because we can't wait 3 years for projects to be approved. Fit for purpose, because it's not about insurance. It's not insuring for a one-off event. When a slow onset event hits a small island developing state, it's over a prolonged period of time. So we need to think creatively of what type of support a fund might be able to channel towards those countries who are facing slow onset events. So we need to work together for implementation. That's the tagline for this COP. I think it is appropriate. We must work together in order to see that we can finally say that we've delivered on our promise to the most vulnerable. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Felson, for that indeed expert presentation, which has set the stage for our panel discussions. And I would like to formally welcome our panel members to the stage this afternoon. The panel will distill on-the-ground experiences of loss and damage in small island developing states, and also what development partners, in this case Germany, is doing to support climate action together with small island developing states. Our panel speakers are His Excellency Toeolesulusulu Cedric Schuster, Minister of Natural Resources and Environment of Samoa, His Excellency Stephen Victor, Minister of Agriculture, Fisheries and Environment of Palau, and His Excellency Jochen Flasbarth, State Secretary in the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development of Germany. I will now invite His Excellency Toeolesulusulu Cedric Schuster for his intervention. Minister.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Thank you, moderator. Yep. Thanks. Thank you, moderator. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. I'll start by about 30 years ago, when the Earth Summit was called. As a Samoan, we were very excited because we had just come out of two very devastating back-to-back cyclones in 1990 that was 3 days long, and a cyclone in 1991 that was 5 days long. So as you imagine, there was so much loss and damage to our environment, to our people, and our heritage. So when the event of Earth Summit was called, we were very excited as a country. Not just Samoa, but a lot of our small island developing states. Why? Because we felt that we're seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. As we've seen, 30 years down the line, that tunnel continues to go further, longer, and longer. So we hope that this, as we continue on in this, that we will finally get there. As you've known and has been mentioned by His Excellency, the Chair for AOSIS, the SIDS have been advocating for loss and damage and climate change impacts for the last 30 years. We have, as mentioned by the recent speaker, we have had some wins, but loss and damage has not been addressed completely. At the recent IPCC reports, it is mentioned and confirmed that we as a small island developing states are the most vulnerable from climate impacts. And if we don't act now, this continues to affect our region. Even if we reduce to 1.1, and it worsens every year, so we need to acknowledge that we've failed so far. And we need to avert this through loss and damage work. While our region continues to call for urgent increase in climate ambitions, we are fully aware that recent pledges to reduce emissions in revised NDCs, the Pacific is locked into a world of extensive and existential loss and damage. The greatest gap that we see in the loss and damage finance is in addressing loss and damage. In this case, the cupboard is bare and there is no meaningful finance at the scale required. For Samoa, the loss of our marine resources, our coral reefs from coral bleaching, the migration of the tuna stocks that are moving out of our EEZ will affect our food security, our economies, our cultural sites, and our natural heritage. And if so, therefore, even minimizing climate change leaves no room to build back better. And this is why the loss and damage facility must escalate at COP27. The current UNFCCC mechanisms are geared towards minimizing through mitigation and adaptation, but they don't help people rebuild as loss and damage. As such, the loss and damage facility is the critically missing third pillar of climate finance. We need to operationalize the Santiago network at COP27, including governance structure that addresses PCID's needs, and it must be robust. In ending, I say this, we must stand together and keep advocating and pushing for our heritage, for our people, and for our disappearing islands. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Minister Schuster. I would now like to invite His Excellency Stephen Victor to take the podium. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. This is my second COP as Environment Minister for the Republic of Palau. And as been mentioned, this issue of loss and damage was first discussed over 30 years ago. I was still a youth when this issue was discussed. Now I'm in a position of being able to make a decision, and I hope we can all make a decision on behalf of the youth and the children of our future. Otherwise, the conversations that we're all having would be pretty meaningless if nothing changes. Between COP26 and COP27, my personal reflection has been that we haven't done enough or have not changed the trajectory of where our inaction is taking us to a world where recovery or survival for many of us in small island states may not even be possible. It's sad to hear that even putting loss and damage on the agenda item, that very few developed countries were pushing back and just even putting it on the agenda at this COP27 because they were concerned about their long-term legal obligations to finance loss and damage. For us as small island developing states, we're concerned about long-term survival and existence on this planet. So when we talk about climate justice, it's not for no good reason. Yes, we all contributed to the problem, but we all contributed in different proportion. yes, we can all contribute to financing it, but our capacity as small island states have very little capacity to finance our own loss and damage, and therefore the global community need to step up to help commensurate with their contribution to the challenge that we face today. I'd like to speak about the lost opportunity of addressing the problem. It's been 30 years. Had we made the political will then to act, the cost of addressing the problem now may be much smaller than what we're talking about the cost now. So the longer the inaction will be, the higher the cost will be. So I hope this conversation around COP27 and further COP move away from negotiating to discussing solutions. We're negotiating about the future of humanity, and we should be discussing about how we address and solve the survival of humanity beyond the 21st century. Because our inaction today is putting humanity at that trajectory that many small island states may find it difficult to survive and to even exist as a nation and as cultures and as people. So how long do we continue to negotiate for our future? We should be discussing these very solutions of how do we finance the current loss and damage, because if we don't address it today, the cost will continue to increase. I've seen more damage in a year after COP27 within Palau because of storm-related events that are attributed to climate change. Just 2 weeks ago, I woke up to a storm that was not predicted to even come close to Palau. But as I got ready to work, then the storm hit, and the whole of government stopped, school stopped, no power supply for the whole of island. So our ability to predict this impact are becoming more challenged, and therefore we're not responding adequately to the disasters that are being caused by climate change. So these are experiences that we're feeling, and I'm sure not only small island states are feeling. Many of us have begun to feel this everywhere across the globe. So we're not here to convince that there's a problem. We know that there's a problem. We're here to decide if we take action today or continue to negotiate and letting big developed countries negotiate with our very lives and the lives of our future children and the existence of our nations and us as people. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Victor. I would like to invite now His Excellency Jochen Flasbarth for his intervention, please.
Hello, everybody. Excellencies, dear friends, happy to be here. As I see, I'm the only non-small islander here, but my very good friend Spencer Thomas, an old climate and biodiversity veteran, once gave me a necklace from corals. I hope they were CITES certified, and inaugurated me as an islander. So I feel in a way at home, and I think Germany for a long time had a very close cooperation with AOSIS, with the SIDS, for good reasons. We are sitting in the same boat, and you spoke about, or the title is Less Division, More Ambition, and that it is what it is all about. Stephen, you said, how long do we want to negotiate with our future? You can't negotiate about future because you can't negotiate with science. And that's where we are. Let me look a bit back, and I think we made some progress. We are not there, but we made some progress. I can tell you, some 8 years ago, when we discussed about loss and damage in a much more reluctant way than we do it at the moment, me and many others from the developed countries had speaking points, and I refused to read them out, that you cannot link one disaster with climate change, and specifically not with emissions from industrialized countries. I mean, how crazy. It's so obvious that there is climate change happening, as many of you outlined, that there are countries much more affected than others, and that those who were responsible for the historic and the ongoing pollutions are not the same one as those that are affected. So it took us a while, and as the ambassador said, I think we can be very happy that it is now on the agenda. I always said we cannot avoid to discuss at the COPs about those things at hand. We could not avoid it on loss and damage. By the way, we will not avoid it on 2.1c. It has to come all on the table to find the right solution. So, having said that, we as Germany, we were promoting the agenda item to get a track. Last COP, Germany also provided some 10 million euros to make the Santiago network to continue on its work. But this is all not enough. And that was the reason why we decided, together with the V20, representing the most vulnerable countries, not the 20, but 58, on the global shield against climate risk. And to be very clear and explicit on this, this was not to avoid a discussion under the CCC as an agenda item and to establish a track under the CCC, but to get on work. And that is what we are doing now together with the V20. We as G7 presidency will launch on the 14th next week with my minister, Svenja Schulze, the Global Shield, the Chancellor Scholz, together with the president from Ghana, this morning organized a breakfast with leaders. And I'm quite for a while in this discussion, but I never heard leaders from the vulnerable countries and the developed countries talking so seriously about what we need to solve. The Global Shield will work in a country-by-country assessment to provide tailor-made, appropriate finance to address what these countries are suffering from. Coming to the end, this is not ambition against adaptation against loss and damage. This is all a package. There is no cherry picking. We need to do we need to address all these three pillars at the same time. And we need to be aware, the less we do for ambition on mitigation, the more we have to do on adaptation, and the less we do on adaptation, the more pain we will create in the world, and the more we have to pay for loss and damage. So let's join together to find the right package, practically, pragmatically, but also on the negotiation track. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Mr. Flasbarth, and to all our panelists for your very excellent interventions. So distinguished participants, what we all heard today is that small island developing states are on the front line of the crisis that they did not create. And yet, they are dealing with the consequences and paying a heavy price. But we also stressed here today that there is still a window of time where we can arrest runaway climate change and build resilient, flourishing island communities. And what we also made clear is that island nations cannot do it alone. They need the international community's support. They need development partners like Germany, United Arab Emirates, and of course the UN system to join them in tackling the impacts of climate change, in addressing loss and damage here and now, including at this COP27. So on behalf of High Representative Rabab, Fatima, and our co-organizers, I'd like to thank you all, our panelists, our distinguished speakers, and thank you all for joining us.